Vertebral column or spine composed of small segments of bone called the vertebrae. The vertebrae has 33 small irregularly shaped bones and divided into 5 groups. First is the cervical vertebrae, 7 bones in the neck. Next is the thoracic vertebrae, 12 bones in the thorax. Next is the lumbar vertebrae, 5 bones behind the abdomen. Next is sacral vertebrae, the 5 fused bones. Next is the coccygeal vertebrae, 3 to 5 or incomplete in number in adults. This is the vertebral curvature. The vertebral column is viewed from the side, has 4 curves. First is the cervical curvature and lumbar curvature has lordotic curve or lordosis. Next is the thoracic curvature and pelvic curvature has a kyphotic curve or kyphosis. Next is the abnormal curvature. First is the levoscoliosis. This is the left curvature of the vertebrae. Next is the dextroscoliosis. This is the right curvature of the vertebrae. Next is the 24 vertebral segments at the upper region that remain distinct throughout life, and it is termed as true or movable vertebrae, which are the cervical, thoracic, and lumbar vertebrae. On the other hand, the sacral vertebrae and coccygeal vertebrae, which are the 2 lower region or pelvic segments, that is termed as false or fixed vertebrae. The typical vertebra or the structure of the vertebra, this is typical because this is the same in character. There are 2 main parts. First is the body of the vertebra and the vertebral arc, which is the posterior ring-like portion. And the other parts are the vertebral foramen, which are enclosed by the body and vertebral arc. Next is the vertebral canal. Next is the intervertebral disc that separates the vertebral bodies and allow the movement of joints. Next is the pedicles, which are the right and left. Next is the vertebral notches, the superior vertebral notch and inferior vertebral notch. Next is the intervertebral foramina, laminae, and there are 7 processes in typical vertebrae, which are the transverse processes, which are in the right and left, and the 1 spinous process, and the 4 articular processes, which are the superior articular processes and inferior articular processes, and also the facet and zygopopliteal joint is also part of the typical vertebrae. Let's proceed to the cervical vertebrae. Remember that all cervical vertebrae contains of 3 foramina, which are the right transverse foramen, left transverse foramen, and vertebral foramen. Next is the cervical vertebrae, which are divided into 2, typical and atypical. It is called atypical because this is not common unlike the other vertebrae. So the first 2 cervical vertebrae are atypical because it is structurally modified that join the skull. Next is the 7th vertebra, which is also atypical because this is slightly modified to join the thoracic spine. The atlas or the C1 is atypical because it has a ring-like structure with no body and very short spinous process that makes it atypical. The atlas consists of an anterior and posterior arc, lateral masses of bone, and transverse processes. Next is the axis or the 2nd cervical vertebrae. This is also atypical because it has a strong conical process arising from the upper surface of its body called the dens or odontoid process that received or hold the anterior arc or anterior portion of the atlantal ring to act as the pivot or body for the atlas. It also has a superior articular processes, inferior articular processes, laminae, and spinous process. This is the 7th vertebra or C7. This is also atypical and it is termed as the vertebra prominens, has a long prominent spinous process that project almost horizontally to the posterior. Next is the typical cervical vertebra, which are the C3 to C6. It has a transverse foramina and articular pillars that makes it different from the other vertebra. And there are also a transverse processes, right and left. And there are also pedicles, superior vertebral and inferior vertebral notch. And it also has a superior articular processes and inferior articular processes. And there are also a spinous processes with bifid tips. And there are also laminae. Next is the thoracic vertebrae. The bodies of the thoracic vertebrae increase in size from the first to 12 vertebrae. The superior thoracic body resembling the cervical bodies, and on the other hand, the inferior thoracic bodies resembling the lumbar bodies. The bodies of the third vertebrae is in triangular in form, and the vertebral bodies are deeper posteriorly than anteriorly, and the posterior surface is concave from side to side. And the thoracic vertebrae contains costal facets for articulation with the head of the ribs. So the body of the first thoracic vertebra, or the T1, presents whole costal facets for the tubercle of the rib, or for the articulation with the head of the first rib. Next, on its inferior border, it presents a demi-facet or half-facet for articulation with the head of the second rib. And for the bodies of the second through 8 thoracic vertebrae, it contains only a demi-facets superiorly and inferiorly. The 9 thoracic vertebrae, it has only a demi-facet on its superior border. The 10th, 11th, and 12th thoracic vertebral bodies has a single whole facet at the superior margin for articulation with the 11th and 12th ribs. And there are also transverse processes of the thoracic vertebra which project obliquely, laterally, and posteriorly. And there are also a laminae which are broad and thick. And there are also a spinous process which is long. And the 5th to 9th spinous process of the thoracic vertebrae is project sharply, inferiorly, and overlap each other. And there are also zygopopliteal joint of the thoracic vertebra and intervertebral foramina. Next is the 5 lumbar vertebrae. It has a large bean-shaped bodies and increase in size from 1st to 5th lumbar vertebrae. And it also has a lumbar bodies that differ anteriorly than posteriorly, transverse processes of the lumbar vertebrae, lumbar laminae, lumbar pedicles, and also a spinous processes. Lumbar vertebrae contains mammillary process, accessory process, and pars and interarticularies that makes it different from the other vertebrae. So the mammillary process of the lumbar vertebrae is smoothly rounded projection on the back of each superior articular process, and the accessory process is at the back of the root of the transverse process, and the pars interarticularis is the part of the lamina between the superior and inferior articular processes. Body of the 5th lumbar is deeper in front than behind, which gives a wedge shape that adapts it for the articulation with the sacrum. And there are also intervertebral disc, spinous process, transverse process, laminae, and zygopopliteal joint of the lumbar region. Next is the sacrum, which are formed by the fusion of the 5 sacral vertebral segments into a curved and triangular bone. This is also a wedge between the iliac bones of the pelvic. And the sacrum has a base, superior articular processes, sacral promontory, sacral canal, and the 4 pelvic sacral foramina, ala, auricular surface, apex, and sacral cornua. The superior surface of the base of the sacrum corresponds in size and shape to the inferior surface of the last lumbar segment, with which articulates to form the lumbosacral joints. And there are also a superior articular processes of the first sacral segments that articulates with the inferior articular processes of the last lumbar vertebra, which form the last pair of the zygopopliteal joint. And at the superior anterior margin, there are sacral promontory, which is the base of the sacrum, and this is a prominent ridge. And there are also a sacral canal that is directly behind the sacral segments, and the 4 pairs of the pelvic sacral foramina is the passage of the sacral nerves and blood vessels. And in the sacrum, there are also a ala, which are found on the each side of the sacral base, and this is a large wing-like lateral mass of the sacrum. And they're also called auricular surface at the supero-anterior part of the lateral surface of each ala is called auricular surface. And this is a large articular process for articulation with similarly shaped process on the iliac bone of the pelvis. And there are also apex of the sacrum on the inferior surface has a oval facet for the articulation with the coccyx and sacral cornua. The sacral cornua is the two processes that projects inferiorly from the posterolateral aspect of the sacral segments to join the coccygeal cornua. Next is the coccyx, which are 3 to 5, usually 4 bones that rudimentary vertebrae that have a tendency to fuse into one bone in adult. And it diminishes in size from its base inferiorly to its apex. So the coccyx contains base, apex, and coccygeal cornua. The coccygeal cornua, it projects superiorly from the posterolateral aspect of the first coccygeal segment to join the sacral cornua of the sacrum. And for the articulations in the vertebral column are the atlanto-occipital joint, the articulation between the superior articular surface of the atlas and the occipital condyle of the occipital bone. Next is the atlanto-axial joint. The anterior arc of the atlas rotates around the dens of the axis. Next is the costovertebral joint, which is the articulation between the head of the ribs and the bodies of the vertebrae. Next is the costotransverse joint. The tubercle of the ribs articulate with the transverse processes of the thoracic vertebrae. Next is the main part of the articulations are the intervertebral, which are the articulation between the two vertebral bodies. Next is the zygapophyseal joint or interarticular joint. This is formed by the inferior articular process of one vertebra articulating with the superior articular process of the vertebra below on the same side of the body. Next is the intervertebral foramen. These are when the two vertebral notches, which are the superior vertebral notch and inferior vertebral notch, join together, it forms the intervertebral foramen. Next is the lumbosacral joint. This is located between the inferior articular surface of the fifth lumbar and the upper end of the sacrum, or to be specific, at the superior articular surface of the sacrum. Lastly, the sacrococcygeal joint is located between the distal end of the sacrum and the first segment of the coccyx.